继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版。这一期上来先把 Casey Muratori 的部分搞定，然后进到 Design 的最后一部分。这个应该没差多少了。
These are excerpts from an interview by Casey Muratori, who I first met back in the 1990s. He was one of the early playtesters of Braid. And, as you'll hear in the interview, Casey was responsible for a substantial portion of the original ideas that inspired this game.
所以他的对话很长，也算老基友了，是吧？While the story screens and the gameplay are somewhat separate story screens 就现在这个就算 story screens，然后当你进去到关卡了就关卡了。The story screens were in the original prototype. Strife involving the story screens， 来吧。3个，这还能继续往前吗 ？Three easy pieces。这个最后这没有意义。わかった。一点没有搞。
How did that idea develop that there was going to be sort of distinct two things, text and the game?
It was baked into the idea at the start.
Okay.
For reasons, right? One, I kind of wanted to write something again. I had written things way in the past, and I was like, I could do something here.
Right.
It was going to be much more of a constrained writing exercise.
Okay.
So part of all of this stuff, so the Olipo, which we mentioned,
yes,
is all about constrained writing according to rules
yes.
or heuristics or algorithms, right?
Right.
And then like these specific books that I was taking inspiration from were like that.
Right.
And so I kind of liked the idea of there's gameplay in the different worlds, and that puts constraints on what the writing is. That's one direction of constraints. Mm-hmm. And then there's an orthogonal direction that's just from writing to writing. Like the intros to these different worlds can have structural parallelism in some way. In the end, there was probably at least one too many constraints on it, and it like the writing quality suffered from it probably, but it's fine. But like I was just interested in that idea. And then also, even before I know it's rewind, there's this idea that doing something in gameplay is more difficult than in fiction, because in fiction fiction just depends on how good you are at rhetoric in some sense.
Right.
Like once there was a world where everybody walked around on their hands.
Right.
And that's just how it is.
Right.
And in games, you have to deal with what that means.
Right, yeah.
And walking on their hands is not that good of an idea, but like you open a door and it goes to another universe or whatever. Like that's an idea where in fiction you can say whatever, but you're describing some rules all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And in games, you have to make those work consistently for it to be a certain class of game. A system-oriented game. Now, of course, whenever I say this, there's always like, well, it could be like the old adventure games where there's just if statements, right?
Right, so you don't really implement the system, you just implement the like particular beats you cared about, and everything else is just not there.
Yeah, but even those are better when they feel system-y, and the way that people figure out, so like Planetfall, for example.
Yes.
Or Starcross actually is even more. Starcross has some objects that are pretty system-y. And the way that you solve the puzzles is you know how they behave, and you use that to engineer the solution.
Yep.
And then the if statements happen to correctly implement the behavior that you wanted.
Right.
Right. And so it's like you're pretending the system is there, both as the player and the author. Right. But as you go more forward in time and games are more capable, it's like, hey, there's more of an actual system.
Right.
And the system is more complex and nuanced. And I was very interested in that.
When you first start designing this game, you went on vacation, and you found that like one thing kind of led to another, and very quickly it built out to something approximating worlds 2, 3, and 4. You even have the text in there, not the final text, but text that's like sort of similar.
Well, and the text is, we could clarify, it's in a different form than you see it in the final game, right? In the final game, it's in a somewhat interactive screen where you run by some books on podiums and it changes the text between stuff. Back then, it was more like the minimal thing you would have to put text into the game. So
spacebar
before each level, just a screen that's, not in the game. It's just a different mode.
Ah,
And it's
okay.
like press spacebar to start the level or whatever, but there's a bunch of text. And in general, it was, all the text for that world on the screen. So it was like a bigger text dump, and you couldn't really go back and read it if you skipped it. And all these things that you would expect from a relatively short amount of effort on a game.
So the text in Braid is something that was revised a bunch of times. The actual last time I played Braid before its release, it had substantially different text than the text that was actually released. So it was getting revised a bunch of times.
Like through development.
Throughout the development.
For sure.
And during the course of this interview, you actually said you think the text maybe wasn't as good as it could have been because, quote unquote, you were trying too hard to make it good, actually. You said that. I don't know what you mean by that. So maybe you could unpack some of that. How did you develop the text? Like, what were you sort of trying to do there? And what did you mean when you said maybe you tried too hard or something? I don't know. I really don't know what you meant. So
there's just a problem that happens if... Okay, so to relate this back to design, broadly speaking, right? One of the best skills as a game designer is to know what something looks like as somebody who just sees it for the first time, where their eyes being drawn, what do they think about all these things, right?
You did mention that multiple times.
It's a little bit similar with writing, probably, except I have not clocked nearly as many hours writing as I have designing games. And so there's this thing that can happen if you're really thinking hard about how to make writing do a lot of things functionally. And like, how do I do this with it? How do I do that to it? How do I connect it to this other part? How do I make it short enough, but also still have some idea in it? And two things happen. One is, unless you do a really good job refreshing yourself, you really early on stop seeing it as somebody does when they see it for the first time. And this becomes very hard. So you just see like little tweaky things about it and whatever, right? And that for sure happened.
Okay.
If I make a game, I know that what people see first helps set their expectations of what the whole thing is about. When it came to the text in Braid, because I was so looking at it up close, I probably failed to account for certain things. So for example, the World 2 text is the first text that people see. And because it's first, it sets expectations thematically for what the game is about and what the point of things are and stuff. Whereas that's actually, I revised that one a bunch, probably too much. And to me, I was more setting it up parallel to the other worlds because that's the structure of the game, right? And not correctly accounting for the degree to which the first thing sets the tone. And to be honest, the World 2 text is my least favorite. It's the one that I think is like the lowest quality and the one that I was never as happy with. And so to date, I haven't revised any of the text for the anniversary edition, but if I did, it would probably be the World 2 text, both for this functional reason and for the fact that like I never was totally happy with it. And some of this unhappiness came from, like when you're writing, being as brief as you can while doing the thing that you're trying to do is generally good advice, right?
Yes.
I think that in some cases, I was trying to be a little bit too brief while trying to do too many things. And what that manifests as is you read something and it just seems weird or like it doesn't totally connect. Because if I'd added another half of a sentence or whatever, it would have made more sense. But I cut that half of a sentence because I was very worried about the thing being too long. So like
it
actually
removes some of the color, like it becomes more stilted if it's super compact.
Yeah, and in fact that's what happened with my game developer articles is they became unreadable because they were forced to fit within a certain footprint. And I think to a little bit of an extent that happened here, especially with things like the World 2 text and whatnot. So if I were to give myself writing advice back at that time, it would be to not be so worried. Like, look, if people are going to read these at all, it's because they have an attention span.
And the people who don't are just going to run by them anyway.
Yeah, and so don't worry that much about optimizing the length. because then especially like weird stuff happens, right? So for example, if you're trying to write and you're trying to be concise and clear, one of the things that you would do, that's, most people will give you this writing advice, is to cut superfluous like adjectives and adverbs,
Right.
because even though they seem to you to be helping set the tone and stuff, they weigh something, and it becomes clumsy if you just have a lot of them, right?
Yeah,
and they take it longer to get to the point that you're actually getting to, right? The problem is, as you try to make things short, like if I want to cut out an entire sentence that would have brought up some concept
你
briefly,
最先
right?
删掉的就那形容词。
and it's like, oh, I want to shorten this so it doesn't have that, but I still want a little bit of a connection to what I'm going to talk about in something shorter than a sentence. I'm going to add back an adjective or an adverb, right?
Yeah.
Which then has, like, that's problematic for the reasons just discussed. And so I think some of that was happening as well, where if I had allowed myself a longer total length of text, yeah, it just wouldn't have suffered from me mashing it down, I think.
所以语言考试的写作跟 professional writing 还是有区别的，用一大堆这种形容词、修饰词来体现你的词汇量。这种在真的日常交流，不管是学术、工作、生活上，有什么用啊？没什么用，就展示一下你的词汇量。就言简意赅就是意思。How the initial idea for Braid started to form. More about the literary inspirations for Braid. 这看过了。哦，go。What's that, mate?
I had an idea.
啊，这就1分60秒。这1分60秒已经出卖了一切。
Once I started thinking about how do I put all this together, like that came in there.
Right. 3 easy pieces. 啊，这个居然有一个没看过。
I guess
idea.
Exactly what one piece of it together. It's obviously not just like, oh, there's this one email and everything happened after the email. There was like a bunch of things, I feel like. So
yes, there are many favorite books.
这个什么
is about, and
it's great.
Where he did physics posed in a certain.
So it's sort of that
analogy even was that the galaxy maybe it's at times there and like short and on what Braid was copying a game version of what I liked about these stories, right?
这个应该是有一点时间了。Literary inspiration. Initial idea started from. Braid was made as a 2D platformer to limit technical risk. 啊，这个上一期看过。To limit the technical risk, to maximize the focus of the design. 就这两个是吧？
Why is it like
啊，这看过。
That, for example,
对，这东西看过。
for projects.
Yeah.
That whole, firstly, eliminate technical challenge and design challenge
by being 2D.
2D. Okay, what kind of 2D? There's lots of 2D games.
This is sort of the
bullseye.
The bullseye of the question, which is I wasn't quite sure how you ended up with.
Well, I already knew, like, okay, we're going to screw around with time.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
At least. And maybe we're going to do this other quantum stuff. It's unclear. But what is the form of it? Well, we know from the Calvino influence, it's about going between different worlds. And the rules change in every world.
Right.
And that's what's cool about it. Like, maybe in this world there's superposition, right? Maybe in this world there's time goes backwards, whatever.
Right.
But it's interesting that part of the entertainment value or the knowledge you take from the game is seeing and understanding those changes, right? How do you do that? Well, somehow you're comparing them with the baseline. If you don't have the ability to compare them, like, hey, we've got this cool superposition thing. How do you understand why the superposition is interesting and how it's cool and how it affects things? Well, you know how the things would have been without the superposition. And then you add the superposition.
Yeah.
Right? And so I was thinking, hey, the value in this game is supposed to come from the cool reality bendy stuff. If the rules of the game are really complicated, and then you apply some reality bendy stuff, you might not even know, like, how some interaction would have resulted in the vanilla one.
Right.
if it's complicated. And then you're going to be uncertain and unclear. And then especially if it's a puzzle game, which I was pretty sure it was going to be.
Okay.
If it's unclear what is the local reality weirdness effect and what is the base rule set, that's a level of uncertainty that you don't want on the ground level when like trying to solve puzzles, right? That's going to mess up the puzzle solving. And so I knew all this without having designed the game at all, which just I think tells you that I'd been thinking about this kind of thing for years in the EGW and elsewhere, right?
Right, okay.
So what are the simple kinds of games? I just thought through them, and Mario game came to mind very quickly, right? Whereas some games in that genre have like a lot of creatures and a lot of characters with different abilities and all this stuff.
Right.
Very clearly, the prototypical Mario game is there's one monster that just goes in a straight line and you could jump on his head.
Right.
Like that's the minimum for the that genre.
Right.
And then you could dial that up. Like you could add more monsters if you want them, if you need more complexity. And so I could figure out later what is the weird stuff and then gauge based on that how much more can the game sustain.
Right.
And I knew all this before literally typing any code.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the selection of Mario was largely driven by wanting the simplest possible visually understandable mechanic that people would just go, okay, the baseline one is obvious to me, so that when it starts getting modified, they're not like, what the heck happened? They could clearly see like, oh, right, it's this.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now you can think about some other games that are simple, like Asteroids is simple. You know, Robotron is simple. And it just, thinking through those, it's like, well, so the Mario game has this element of like, it's a guy, right?
Yeah.
And that brings it to a human scale. Like the Mario games, Mario's a character. And that's a little bit like the humanity in the stories that I wanted to like, I wanted to bridge to that. If you have like a little arrow-sized spaceship, you're not getting that, right?
Right.
So
was that a concrete thought you had when evaluating these?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I thought through a bunch of them. And in fact, this was probably the genesis of the idea that there were going to be a bunch of retro games in Braid as well. Of
right,
other
which we'll
genres.
have to talk about since that did not actually happen.
That did not actually happen.
We should talk about those.
Yeah.
啊，就那个东西。
The idea was that the rewind was a surprise, and there's and
这看过没有？
oh, it's because
that there's rewind
it live.
Okay.
Also, it had released Chromatron and like 100
这我看过。
songs. Like in reality, Helsingberger, right?
Yeah,
to be able to walk through that world and like there's nothing going on.
Right.
Chromatron 是非常硬核的一款游戏，今天看到的东西我已经搜过了。这款游戏后面我可能会玩，因为现在是完全免费，只要下载就行。对硬件要求极低，是非常硬核的这种逻辑的游戏。我觉得又是一款 Steam 专属的游戏。这款游戏呢，你还能称赞它的音乐跟美术风格，那款可能纯粹就是逻辑了，也没有什么画风跟音乐了。反正没打开过。只看过。
And so those were all the seeds of this thing, and they came together at this time.
Right. The regularity of this game's puzzle structure. 这个。
You know, you kind of those instances
or add to
all of it's because
they hit about
verification.
I see.
But it was a guess that turned out to be okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Rewinding implemented as an initial basic gameplay feature. Leap of Faith. 这顶上有一个。Holy shit.
Rewind was the way that I mapped bi-directional arrow of time. Rewind was the way that I mapped bi-directional arrow of time into a concrete feature that I could type, right? So let's type the feature in, let's make it work. And it wasn't that hard, you know, given what I had, right? I don't remember exactly how long it took, but way less than the week. Right? So then I had that and I was playing around with it. And, you know, there like isn't that much you can do with that aside from, isn't it cool?
That's
Right.
why I was interested in how'd you get over this initial hump, right? Like,
Well, there's a simple answer to that. But before that, right away I was thinking about this problem of like, okay, it's interesting in the way that had been discussed on the mailing list, but you could, the initial implementation of just rewind, like you can imagine what that would be if I said Mario with rewind. It's
Right.
like, all right,
Yep.
cool. Now, there's a fundamental shift, though, that already was in place before I even decided the rewind, which is that it's not that it's a game with technical features.
right.
It's that it's a game about how those features change the gameplay. Like that was part of the Calvino Lightman ethic
Right.
that I had going in. And so the initial problem is like, okay, I have this technical feature. I have implemented it. It is rewind.
Yes.
How can the game be about rewind?
Right.
And right away I start asking questions, and you can come up with some stuff like, well, it could be a lot harder than it could be without rewind. And
Right.
You know.
You could just make it so that you're basically doing a tool-assisted speed run, as we would call it
Yeah.
today.
怎么突然扯到
that
这
might
个？
not be very fun,
Right.
but it is evident that things that are unfair without rewind become more fair with
啊，
rewind.
这个就是 fair unfair 了。
What else can you do? You could go forward into somewhere very dangerous that you would regret going and get information that
Right.
you wouldn't have earlier in the game.
Right.
OK，
And then I was like, oh, yeah, well, there is this game design wisdom that people have about how to design games, especially around platformers. And there's this term called leap of faith, which is taught to game designers, at least around the GDC when I was hanging out.
Okay.
I don't know what kids learn in school these days,
Okay.
but like it was a known, I didn't even ever make a platformer, but I knew leap of faith is bad because you're expecting the character to jump into somewhere that they don't know. And
Right.
if they die, if there's somewhere that they die down there and somewhere that they don't, you can't expect them to know in advance. It's completely unfair.
Right.
So don't make your level that way. And
Right.
well, there are extremes of that. It's like maybe you die at 100% of the places, and it's like, well, how would they know that either?
Right.
Maybe it's safe at 100% of the places. It's like, well,
这观点
that's
别的地方
probably
讨论
better,
过。
but like it's still not good because you're forcing them to do something that they don't know is a good move. And if there's any other pits that go off screen anywhere else in the game, you're now still again creating an unfair and uncertain situation. And
Right.
so, well, that's not true if you have rewind.
Right.
Like free rewind. And that was one of the theses in the beginning. Like I said in the Moriarty talk, he was like, it should be totally free. And you were like, it should just be a feature of the system.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay.
OK。哎，刚刚的 BGM 好像从来没听过的样子。啊，这个。
If you were hanging or
Ah,
season the game and Braid, I struggled with tweaking the parameters to make this level nicer to play, but parameters that work here seem bad for the rest of the game. We discussed some reasons for this over here, and some more over here.
Jump Height Alternative Design 这都看过了。啊，所以叫 Level Name 哦，Leap of Faith。信仰之约，这个是真正的信仰之约啊。然后这儿是，啊，这个应该看过了吧，对吧？Making rewind the true focus of the game， 啊，就讨论那个什么 feature and design。
That was one of the, it's like, okay, I'm some
The exist
obviously
or
in consequence, and you make the game too easy and all that stuff.
Right,
Yes.
right.
But you could mitigate that in the following ways.
Right, right.
And absolutely nobody said design a whole new game around rewind.
right. Just like make consequence not the important part or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
The idea to make some objects unrewindable came from the programming phase.
On this same initial 1 week thing,
Yeah.
I have plenty of free headspace because I'm chilling, I'm on vacation, everything's good.
Vacation.
And I'm excited about this idea. And I've typed in the rewind code, and it works by telling you what fields of entities have changed.
Right.
And so there's an outer loop that's for all entities in the world.
Right.
And there's an inner loop that's for all fields in this entity.
Right.
And transmit that information to the rewind buffer or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
You don't exactly know where this idea comes from, but it's a very simple idea that I just have. Maybe I woke up with it, or maybe I was just chilling, but I was like, like if there was a bug or something, Or maybe I could just do it intentionally. Just some of those objects are not visited by that loop,
Right.
right? And then that gives me two classes of things. It gives me things that always go forward in time and things that
Right.
rewind in time. And right away, like even as soon as I have that idea, like I don't know what to do with it yet,
Yeah.
but it's like, oh, that is the kind of cool and weird and expanding the rewind idea that I'm looking for, right?
It feels, just as you say it, to be very in line with like the Calvino Invisible Cities kind of thing, where it's like, oh, there's these kind of like different permutations of things happening as I go through.
Yes.
And I don't know the Einstein Dream one, but I assume that was kind of similar. Like there would be, it's the kind of thing you would see in that kind of work, I guess.
Yeah, I mean it's weird reality basically.
Yeah.
But it still has all the character or all the like it's still a system with well-defined rules in fact.
Right.
Right? So as soon as I had that idea, that was pretty easy to put in. And then as soon as I had that idea, I was like, what else can I do with the rewind? And I know that I did 3 worlds in that initial beta. And I think it was literally what's now World 2, 3, 4, right?
Okay.
So World 2 is rewind.
Right.
World 3 is rewind with objects that are exempt to rewind.
Right.
And World 4 is time is tied to space. And I think there was just like 1 level of that or 2 at the end.
Right.
In fact, I think it was t equals x and then t equals y, which there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's say goodbye to Casey Muratori 是要最后一个部分 Chris Moore， 把再确认一下，保险起见。先从最里面开始，给我打那个 Chris Moore， 打 Chris Moore， 没了啊。这个顶上的人过去，哪里？这好像没有写 Conversation with Chris Moore introduction。
It's April 2022, and I am here in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
New Mexico.
Dr. Chris Moore of the Santa Fe Institute. Or how would you like people to know you?
Hair doctor professor, of course. Or I think it's hair professor doctor, actually.
You do have hair.
I do
Quite
have
long
hair. Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
So we've made some experiments and talked for a while about what's the best way to concretely convey useful information and thoughts about the game. And it seems to work very well to play through the game from beginning to end and just comment on what we see and what we think about it. And really the goal of this conversation is to talk about what Chris likes and thinks is interesting, because I can do what I like later, right, anytime.
Yeah, so we're going to play through the game and focus on my favorite puzzles and like what their structure is, what they're teaching the player, kind of those moments of aha and revelation that the game produces, and how each one teaches you how to use the mechanic, often in a new way. And then I guess we'll use those individual puzzles as jumping off places for talking about sometimes the game as a whole and the design philosophy behind the game. And yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thinking about the way time works in the world.
I actually don't have that much to say about World 1. I love, of course, the fact that it's World 1 and that the numbering goes backwards. That's a nice hint. You can read the text in the other direction if you want.
这个声音是 Doctor。
And the flowers are closing instead of opening. I love how the music plays backwards, and you have to do 3 increasingly tricky things about riding backwards monsters. It's fun to think a little bit about the logic of like, well, wait, what is the monster's actual past? The monsters have 2 pasts that merge into the same present and future. One of them is falling from the cannon, and the other is jumping down from the door, and your
这个居然能爬的，
bonking them merges those 2
这个梯子能爬的。
pasts into the future, which is pretty wild, right? When we think about the multiverse, we're always thinking about the present splitting into 2 futures. There's a rather mysterious thing in an advanced area of mathematics called a co-multiplication, where instead of taking 2 things, combining them and producing one, you're taking one and splitting it into two.
The idea behind the whole world was to do time being bidirectional in some way, right? This is one of the ideas that was left over from the original game that I decided to bring in the end. How do we do that there actually are two directions that time is going simultaneously and you could see it either way, right? And
To
so
really take that seriously.
yeah, and
As
so
opposed to like it's forward plus tweaks.
yes. So the monsters are living backwards in some way and the player is playing forward. Now, because it's a video game made for you, you do have a little bit of like executive privilege here in that you're able to change their past and they're not able to change your past because what would that mean?
Right.
But the only other way that I thought about that this could possibly work, maybe I wasn't imaginative enough, but you could just imagine that both things are happening and they kind of just don't affect each other. But that's not very interesting, right? And so if you're going to affect the other direction of time, how does that work? And this is what I came up with for that.
We could simply be observers in a multiplayer video game played by the trolls
Yeah.
going in the other direction, in
Troll.
which there is one really horrific enemy called Tim, but no, backwards, we're like a super friend who's always like resurrecting them and debunking them.
Could be.
And wow.
Could be.
这个有用吗？哦，好，这有什么意义吗？哦，你要让他在那儿相杀，这怎么可能？相杀点现在是不是越来越靠？啊，好像是的，越来越靠这儿了。因为这个的频率比较高，是吧？这个的频率高，那个的频率低，久而久之就会出现相杀了。但我现在要进去听那个了，肯定要把这听完的。The non-laws of physics are pretty bi-directional.
Let's talk about the physics thing for a little bit that
你这个
motivated
博士
this, which is
物理学
you
的
know,
博士
there's this interesting thing about physical laws that they all appear to be valid bidirectionally, even going back to Newton's laws, right?
At least the
Time-
microscopic ones.
Yeah, and then
Newtonian
even, you know, when you
laws.
get to quantum mechanics and quantum field theory and all this stuff, it gets a little more complicated. But there's this thing called CPT invariance, where,
Right.
where you flip selected combinatorics
Charge
of-
parity and
of,
time.
Charge parity and time, and you get a valid system
这些
running
这些
in
公式
reverse, right? So that was just the inspiration for this whole world was just like, what if we take that seriously? Because a game is a running
Shit.
system. It's a little universe, right?
Mhm.
And it's not nearly as sophisticated or interesting as the actual universe, but we can use that because it's simpler. We can like focus, and then there's a certain kind of magic that we can do, where you do something in the game that is not really possible in the real world, but it seems almost like it would be.
Right.
And we do a little bit of that in Witness too, right? But in this game, it's like, let's take that law of physics a little bit seriously. And how do we make it actually work? How do we give you that experience that forward and backward in time are equally valid and create two equally valid perspectives, right? Like if I were living the opposite direction in time, everything would make sense to me. If I were some kind of creature for which entropy
Right.
appearing the reverse of what looks sensical to us made sense, right?
Yeah. In the morning, you would unscramble an egg for breakfast, or well,
Yes.
you would eat the breakfast and then unscramble the egg.
You
Or
would
well,
uneat the breakfast.
actually, yeah. Yeah, this could get horrible if we follow it up.
Yeah.
I mean, I also love the background art here. We see these kind of steam vents or little volcanoes or whatever they are, with the smoke being drawn down into them. That's really cool.
Which, of course, when you rewind, they appear
Absolutely.
the normal direction.
Oh.
And some things you can't really tell.
吸进
So
去
like the little lightnings and stuff, it's like, oh, are those going forward or backward? And
It doesn't matter.
I mean, I guess you could imagine some weird mechanics where, like, you have a move now which consists of unfalling from a platform, but I don't know how that would work because, You know, if it were really reverse time, you'd press the key after you unfell back up to the platform.
Yeah, I thought about that kind of stuff, and I couldn't come up with anything.
Yeah.
All right，哦，会重置的是吧？你来吧，我要把那个先拿掉，先把那个看掉，这样后面就不用回来了。これクソうざい啊！不要进去了，这很费时间的是吧？要好好等一下了。以为别人，我操，以为别人能看了。他这个需要一路慢慢等过来的。对，现在这个轻追点了这 kiss point 一点点过来了，看 kiss point 是一点点过来了。かなり遅いですね。好坑爹的谜题啊！看来这附近没有什么直接能听的，对吧？对，这没有直接能听，全部要进啊！对，因为是 playthrough， 对，想起来，他说的是 playthrough 的东西。This is a pretty garbage puzzle 来了没有？来了吗？啊，已经到这儿了，还挺快。It's a pretty garbage puzzle anyway。来，越来越近了。来了，紧张。いいね。いけ。要跟他一起进去是吧？これ其实你母子呢，还不能被他射死。下一发应该可以过去了。抓，可以了。The hardest puzzle is なんでお前さ、クソやな啊！就这个是吧？这个你确实没看过吗？
I think for a lot of people, this is their single favorite puzzle in the game. I was playing with this with
some people complain about it because it's
hard.
Well, it's probably
Right.
the hardest puzzle in the game.
What
Right?
was
I
it?
think for a lot of people, this is their single favorite puzzle in the game. I was playing with this with
some people complain about it because it's hard.
Well, they're
it's
wrong.
probably the hardest puzzle.
They're wrong.
Right? There is a platform. It's really high. It's like twice jump height or something.
Right.
And it's really far. It's so far from anything else that you clearly can't jump across either. You have this question like, what even am I expected to do here, right? And in the initial configuration of the level, the monster doesn't even come over here yet. So there's like nothing if you just walk over here from level load.
So yeah, there's the platform puzzle farther to the left with the shadow platform to get him over here.
Yeah.
But honestly, it didn't take me that long to figure this one out.
我也差不多。
Because it's presented to you in such a stark way. Now, you've seen other places in the game where you have to do some kind of double jump to get to higher places. Sometimes that means jumping off two monsters. We saw this sometimes with a little air control and execution. We can jump off one monster twice.
Right.
Oh, but there's our double.
It's just interesting to see as a designer how, you know, some people find certain things hard and other things easy. There's not really a uniform, this is easy, this is hard. But this puzzle is, broadly speaking, one of the harder ones.
You know, there's two interesting things about this, I think. One is that in a lot of other places in the game, when there's tricky timing, like way back in Leap of Faith, you're like, oh, but I can rewind and adjust the timing. Well, but now rewind is a resource that you're using because you have to set up the shadow. But I think the other nice thing about this is once you have that idea, you think, oh my god, that's so acrobatic. How am I going to get that right? And it takes a couple tries, but it's actually not that hard to get right. The execution is not that hard.
It's not that hard.
But then you're so proud of yourself as a player when you pull it off.
这其实是一种，你可以讲 illusion， 设计出来 illusion， 让你感觉很难。
Let's see. The next one is crossing the gap, and this one has two elements I really like. So, you know, first there's this cool thing of, well, the cannon doesn't produce a troll unless I bunk that troll, but I want to be up here when the cannon produces a troll. So, oh, okay, I will send my shadow self down there to bunk the troll. No problem. That's kind of fun. A little bit of platform control, but not hard. And then there's this wonderful fact that, oh, well, since the troll has the purple aura, it can interact with both real things and the shadow things. And then by controlling the timing of the platform and its shadow, because again, everything has a shadow. It's not just that we have a shadow in this world. Then we can actually do this cool 3-way switch and send the troll in several different directions. And, we can briefly create a platform that goes all the way across, which is half real and half shadow, which is pretty nice.
Yeah. For me, that was the neatest part of the level. Hey, can we make the monster walk on nothing?
Right.
A little bit, right?
Exactly.
Like, isn't that kind of cool?
And we saw a foreshadowing of that earlier, way back in, I think the very first world, where we're briefly on nothing because we rewound.
Yeah.
And we're standing on something that was there before. And so now, it's a different version of nothing.
And it's more.
And something which is there not before, but in a parallel world. And it's a nice manipulation.
Now, there's an aesthetic game design choice there that can be made one of two ways. So if you have a monster like this that's in both realities and you want it to be supported, right? Is it that it's supported when it's supported in either reality, or is it supported when it's supported in both realities?
It could be an
right?
and or an or.
Exactly. And I chose this version because I wanted to do this.
Right.
And it seemed cool. It seemed better to do that because the alternative is, he's kind of falling through stuff. Maybe it would have been good. I don't know. I just never figured it out.
Well, for the sequel, you could have many different colors of sparklies and tiny icons indicating a complex Boolean circuit hovering over each troll. Okay, just kidding.
Just kidding. 好，切。OK， 那这样这个解掉了。这样右边就没了是吗？那先把它做了。复刻。OK， sa extreme security， 200钥匙。这个就是之前提到的这个设计是吧 ？Holy mother fuck！ 这 ，How my god！ 这只怪怎么射过来？它这东西不受影响。What？ 绿色的门是不会那个的是吗？其实这个要是优先度更高是吧？而且你这样还能上去吗？也これでも死ぬじゃね？我能不能再拿那把钥匙？これ無理だろ。好，这無理じゃん。大概有想法了。いや違うね。いやこれ無理だな。きち。What the fuck is that? Shitty level。那把钥匙只能用一次。这个拼图我来瓦嘎打呢，瓦嘎里玛啥？这个，那为什么这里需要怪啊？这怪有什么用啊？把它裁掉之后，它会发射过来，是吧？这发射过来有什么意义呢？发射过来你可能才能跳得回去，是吧？哎，这整个东西感觉很奇怪的样子。我觉得右边这片区域不需要你一定要下来的到这个地方，然后才能 rewind。对，否则你一旦 rewind，team 就回去了。你要让这个门重新刷出来，看懂了。剩下就是这个地方了。 是这面拼图，当你们全部解开就能下来了。这只怪是不能把它干掉的嘛？干掉也行，干掉靠 rewind 就行了。下来之后，你可以先疯狂 rewind， 对吧？先疯狂 rewind， 把这些门刷出来，把怪刷出来，然后把这只东西干掉。干掉之后，大炮射出来，射到它差不多是沟里面，然后你可以踩着这东西上去，重新上去，然后再踩着这个东西上到这个门上，跳到这个门上，跳到这个就可以了。绿门一旦开了就不能解了。OK， 我要干你妈是打。这个地方应该是要刻意避开这把绿色的钥匙，所以他才这么设计。真他妈设计了一大堆门，我操！然后他们塞血卡拉亚伦的话意见嘞，反正现在这些门肯定已经解开了，是吧？解完之后，这个门是要拿那个什么？对，可以。这个门是拿这把绿色的钥匙解。解完之后，这就不能再 rewind 了。这里千万不能 rewind。这边是老样子，开，不用推了，这个已经可以了。然后这会儿是疯狂 rewind， 把那个该刷的刷出来，或者直接到起点就行了。可以了吧？对，只要该刷的刷出来就行了。但这样这块拼图也没了。然后再是踩掉之后，那只怪应该会射出来，射到那沟里面，对不对？原来如此哦，这个是我有点歪打正着的。OK， 这片也不算噔啊，这个出去应该容易吧？容不容易其实无所谓。好久没有做题了，这个面是肯定能搞得定的。怎么来着 ？Chris likes this level a lot 这名字好蠢。Chris likes this level. In another castle.
Here in another castle, this is another one of these like
Zen-con
levels.
他的话不
It
多
all， fits on one screen. It poses a pretty clear paradox.
这是他的主场，
Like, gee,
就相对
if
简洁了。
only I could use the ring to slow down that horizontal platform to maybe get over there by the time the key is dropping. But I would
I
also
have to use the ring.
use the ring to slow down the vertical cannon so I can get up there to flip that lever.
Correct.
If only I could do that. Oh, I can. And it's a reminder that rewind,
It's still in the game. It's not just
still in
how
the
you
game.
resurrect yourself.
It's not just how, and it's also, I think a lot of the recent uses of rewind were to rewind sort of one thing, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here we're setting up a fairly long sequence where the ring is in two different places and rewinding all the way back through to the previous place it was. And then there's this awesome cinematic hero move here where you get to leap through the air, catch the key in midair as it falls,
对，非常帅，是
and
吧？
do it in
Slow-mo.
slow-mo. And it looks so
超帅
fantastic.
的。
There is an alternate solution to the puzzle where you put
这样
the
吗？
ring down around the bottom to slow down the key as it falls. It's barely achievable and
Right.
not as fun, but you
Well,
can
good.
do it that way.
Okay, so again, a twitchy way without as much.
哦，
Bottom
原来如此。
to slow down the key as it falls. It's barely achievable and
Right.
not as fun, but you
Well,
can
good.
do it that way.
Okay, so
这样啊。
again, a twitchy way without as much thought, and a less twitchy way with more thought.
Yeah.
It's also, of course, wonderful that, I mean, we've seen a couple of places now where the ring is on something
会弹起
moving,
来。
like a cloud
这试一下。
or like the elevator. It's wonderful that it can fall
弹到
through
细
the
下来。
air with the key
Fuck you.
and continue working.
Oh yeah.
Right, because at first you might think the ring is a thing which lives on stationary objects.
可能来不及是吧？穿我来得及。嘿 ，OK。 然后，嘿，哇，damn！このジャンプむずいな。このジャンプ結構むずいね。拿到之后死了不屌用。确实拿得到，但啊，关键这跳很难，是吧？错了，不容易啊。哦，確かに見たことあるね。这个应该看过了，还有 reprises。啊，怎么到这儿了？这哪儿啊？啊，这是呢 speed run 的部分，早就没了。上古时期的东西。
Here is a simplified version. Only a small amount of experience goes up with an exemption. Slow front, feel less falling on it. A flow of ideas from puzzle to puzzle, and that flow itself becomes observable by the player, and the sequence creates a more than the sum of its parts effect that can be quite sublime when fully appreciated. This level works because the normal speed have it fall decision quite tried to do this not just because it's internally consistent in terms of the laws of the world, but also because I wanted to further emphasize the change in time behavior with as many audio visuals as possible, and the ring's sound effect is very prominent at these times.
还有这样的答案 ？Chris likes this level a lot. More excuses. 1/r² or 1/r 哦，就是那个戒指的效果是吧？1/r² or 1/r， 这是公式定义的问题了。
And now, again, you know, these themes and variations. Now we have the clouds. Before we controlled their spacing with rewind, and now we've got the ring, and this first puzzle isn't too hard, and we can just slow down the clouds and get over there. The second puzzle, I think the reason why it took me so long to think of the solution is that you had a platform with a flower on it for purely decorative purposes in a level long ago. And
right.
so I thought of this as purely decorative. And so...
See, that's maybe a backfire, because the intent was...
提示是吧？
You know, the way I think about these levels is they sort of come in pairs, right? They're
reprises
of each other. And the interesting thing about a reprise is you just get to juxtapose them in your mind and see what's different about them and all that stuff, right? And so this platform needed to be here for this puzzle to work.
Right.
And so... Like, if it wasn't on the other one, then maybe it's less like the same level. Although that said, it probably in reality it would have been fine, right? But it's interesting to hear that because I'd never had that thought that might cause people to disregard the platform, as opposed to maybe continually wondering why it's there.
Right. I guess for me, I read this as a bit of clever misdirection because I was used to the idea that that was just decoration.
But you got it eventually.
I got it eventually.
Cheat off the internet.
I did not cheat off the internet. I did get it eventually. The other nice thing here is the influence of the ring is pretty long range. You know, visually it looks like it might not change things outside the circle, but it changes things from quite.
应该是 R² 是吧？
Is it a 1/r?
我觉得应该是 R²，不是 1/r。
If I remember correctly,
真的假的？
it is a 1/r rule.
I didn't remember correctly.
Ah, yes, because that's how gravity would work in 2 dimensions.
In 3D, we all know about these 1/r
squared
laws, and that's because if you take a sphere that's equidistant from any given point, and then you enlarge it, right?
And the lines of force are getting spread
out.
According to Gauss's law.
Gauss's law.
This is your wheelhouse right here.
Yeah.
When it comes to something like this, I had that idea from the beginning that like, oh, it's probably r instead of r², but I did try.
应该是 R² 的，我感觉。从这游戏的感觉。
Too quickly.
Yeah, it just wasn't that good. Like, you want this feeling of like going into molasses and things are slowing down. Right?
Slow down design.
it's much more like you're in the circle or you're not.
啊
With a fringe around it, but the fringe is hard to
，problem
like
solve
problem
with，
solve with because you don't get yeah it's
Yeah.
very yeah
没猜错，这个 doctor 应该就是一个 physics 或者说 physics related doctor professor anything，然后这个 John 应该是个 programmer，都要本科学的东西，slow down design 这看过了吗？
when we're sitting down just
对，这就是这个图嘛，对。
most on Mickey as possible and that this would base and I didn't like that either. One, here's the code from the games 2 to the minus x.
最后是 one 是对，是这个公式，这说过了。2 to the power of minus 1 over r， 那也不是 1 over r， 也不是1 over r squared， 不太一样。Puzzles that bleed into each other, intended versus unintended solutions. Bleed, cascade.
And then Cascade, all right.
啊，这看过了。
This is like a Rube Goldberg thing. There's all sorts of things going on in this level. Think about rings, the new ring.
啊，这个东西这么早就看过，所以还很乱。
Here is to play, but for me, maybe I'm getting old, but that would be tough for me.
他刚刚评价了那个 Slash 什么来着？我很关心。这个游戏算上这个 commentary， 我也不会玩超过多少小时？50个小时应该不会吧 ？Slash 我可以玩200小时，而且是非常实打实的200小时，不像现在这样跟老年人听说书一样。这东西你感觉很让人昏昏欲睡，但这个总比你练习黄金草莓来的好。练习黄金草莓虽然确实全力以赴，但是很累的。It's very tough. It's not easy. 感受过的都懂。当然痛并快乐。
But not so hard.
What do you think of Celeste?
Again, because I'm not a super platformer. I mean, like I'm not somebody who could play like Celeste, right?
Okay.
I understand the beauty and the joy of those games.
Yeah, beauty and joy 是的，这类游戏就是适合一部分人。典型的就是游戏选人了啊，不是玩家选游戏，不是你觉得这游戏好玩不好玩，是你是否被这个游戏选中。你如果没有被选中，也不用气馁，因为每个人都不一样。Admitting solutions at multiple levels of goodness. Solutions at multiple goodness. Impassable foliage. またお前がよしね。
The next level, impassable foliage. This one was one of the harder ones for me.
Really?
But I think that's because there was an idea I was missing. And again, I think it's and
看肯定看过的。
hard underneath. We need to, because if the can touch up the over solution.
啊，对，原来在这儿是吧？这个 goo なんとかかんとか在这儿。
To like also use element to them, either to the setting or the solution.
Word of goo.
Yeah.
I like World of Goo.
Yeah. I mean, analog can become very messy if you're not careful, which is why you don't see it too often. But it can be an interesting space to explore.
这个 Doctor 的东西不是很长，下一期如果按这个节奏，下一期应该是能搞定。我一定要加上几个字，绝对不轻易立 flag。More excuse， 不能轻易立 flag，知道吗？啊，就这儿是吧？然后 Alternative Design， 这个肯定是看过，这个位置我都知道。
Here's a version. Usefulness.
Oh.
Here is also the key to solving the puzzle. It's
Right.
a positive surprise, and there's magic to it. This is what I mean by an artful excuse.
More
We
excuses.
gave the elevator a reason to exist that feels natural in order to make it
Less
suspicious.
suspicious.
So elevator I tried out, but
Elevator and it
just
solves out. And here you're like, I used it already, and so
right.
yeah, and that just helps it feel good, and it's something that I wish more games did more of, because it's really wonderful to see it done well.
Got you. OK， 这样结束了，还挺快，已经到哪儿了？可以直接撤了。Chris Moore， 这没多少东西。这个就属于他的 playthrough， 然后他谈哪些关有趣，哪些关觉得操蛋，差不多这个意思。这个地方应该看的不多。这个游戏基本上就是一个 STEM 专属游戏，你基本可以讲是有一点歧视的因素在里面。未成年时期理工科的 Wildo 玩这个游戏，估计玩的挺舒服。 先慢慢看。An interesting time with the boss monster。这如果说能把这集看完就可以了。这样的话，前面那些应该一起也许能搞定。差不多2个 screen，2个到3个 screen。那第一个 screen 很小。哎，哦，这儿。
So then there's then
我就回一下，这应该是看过。
Relaxed about where in the middle you decide to do this from.
Right.
You know?
It's interesting. So in some of these puzzles,
Yes.
the design had a very narrow window.
Yes.
In a couple of them, the execution for the player was
Twitchy.
Is that like twitchy runtime and twitchy compile time or something?
I don't know.
Twitchy coding
I
time?
certainly didn't think about that
at that time. Fragile companion. 这 fragile. This puzzle is simple but confusing. Fragile companion. 哦，这道题。对，这道题确实。
I like the fact that a couple of the worlds end with a very nice minimal puzzle.
对，
that
但
lets
是
you
意外
take
的
what you've learned
不算太简单。
and it gives you again. It's like a little paradox, a little koan.
Koan.
You know, this one takes a little bit because it's like, well, we have one key in the world, but the key has a shadow, so one of us needs to open one gate, the other needs to open the other gate. How does that happen? Because if we try to, quote, program the guy and just head into the gate, well, it just uses up the key and then it's broken and it's not rewindable. My solution to this, actually, which I was quite proud of, is significantly more elaborate than the simplest solution. I bonked the guy, didn't take the key, then I went up and stood by the gate without the key.
Yeah.
But before bonking him, I did a motion
such
that my shadow self then picked up the key and took the shadow key to the gate. I then went back, picked up the real key, and opened the other gate. Aren't you proud of me?
I guess.
This is like way more complicated.
I'm still not sure how you
solution.
do the motion. Yeah, the solution I had in mind when I did this was just to come up with something a little bit simpler, right? So the problem is, of course,
which also uses the mechanic in a nice way. So.
If you use the key in your universe ever, right?
It's gone.
It's gone. The point being, though, you can generate an infinite number of shadow guys with shadow keys, so it doesn't matter if his goes away, right?
对。
And so
这其实可以放更多的门。
Just aim yourself and just rewind.
Rewind before you hit
the gate. And this platform is placed so that you can do a nice ballistic motion.
And again, because he does what you do, as opposed to going where you went, his ballistic motion continues, even though you never went there.
Now, this is the minimalist version of the level, because if I wanted to do the shock version of the level, I could have put like 9 gates in a row, and you would have been like, oh, this is completely absurd. And it would have been a little tweakier, but maybe I could have figured out a way to make it like nice. But you know, you can jump actually standing right before the gate, and as long as you rewind, you know, the guy will hit it. And that's sort of the speed run way to do it, right?
You know,
like
his ballistic motion continues, even though you never went there.
Now, this is the minimalist version of the level, because if I wanted to do the shock version of the level, I could have put like 9 gates in a row, and you would have been like, oh, this is completely absurd. And it would have been a little tweakier, but maybe I could have figured out a way to make it like nice. But you know, you can jump actually standing right before the gate, and as long as you rewind, you know, the guy.
Right.
And that's sort of the speed run
my
way
boots.
to do it, right?
We start doing more complex things with the behavior in this world, revealing something new about the behavior of World 5. Window of Opportunity. 这关倒是不怎么常见，有2个那个东西吗？
So then in, let's see, Window of Opportunity, this has a couple nice elements. You know, there's this coordination in the first part about one of us, me and my shadow, needs to open this gate. Another one of us needs to open that gate so I can get back out. And then, one of us needs to be over there to drop through. There's a little bit of timing. It's not too bad, but a little bit of timing involved in, oh, this purple glowy gate needs to not be unlocked yet when I'm jumping on it, but then it needs to be unlocked by the time I'm trying to get back out. And, you know, a little bit of execution, but not bad.
对，他是一个 doctor， 他不是玩 Celeste 的玩家，这还是有区别。
In the second puzzle of this level,
这个是有点超难。
Okay, more purple glowy levers. One of us needs to get up there and pull that lever.
不能太早。
Okay, But then we learn
稍微等
something
一下。
really profound here, which is that when we rewind and create this shadow, he's not going where we were, he's doing what we did. So that means we've now seen 3 versions of what it means to go back into the past.
挺长。
One is rewind, one is moving to the left in the space equals time world, and now there's getting him to do the things we programmed him to do in the past, but interacting with the world as it is.
As it is now.
Well, from the design standpoint, it's actually much simpler to implement. Like just putting the guy in history where you were, right? It's basically just doing rewind on a shadow universe. But I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to be reenacting what you did, but with possible differences in the world state, because that's just more interesting. And it's more, in my mind, fictionally, what this is in the game is like, there's a different reality. It's, it forks
It's
at some point.
it's a
It has you in
multiverse.
it. And it's a little weird, but, this game's a little weird.
I mean, in terms of the metaphors and the surrounding story, it's like, well, we all wish that we could have done things differently. We feel that there are these endlessly branching realities, and wouldn't it be great if we could cross that parallel world or cooperate across that branching sometimes? I think the other thing I like about this puzzle is that he's these 2 levers and these 2 platforms. It's not clear, like, who should do what. And so I think I tried a couple of times solutions where it was my normal self riding up the large platform in order to reach the lower lever. And you try that a couple times and there doesn't seem to be a way to do it. And can I send him onto the little platform on the pillow? How do I get him over? Could he get the puzzle piece for me? So it's one of these nice, I think, puzzle design elements where there are several things that look like hopeful strategies.
Yeah. And
one of them doesn't work, but the one that does work forces you to learn this new thing about the mechanic.
Yeah, and as a designer, I actually expect people mostly to try what you were just saying first, because it seems more direct action, right, to do things that way. And in fact, you can, if you're super tweaky, you can get your shadow guy up there to the puzzle piece, but the puzzle piece isn't shared between universes, so he gets it, but you don't.
Yeah,
Sunning
exactly. It does not have the purple glow. Good point.
Yeah.
Maybe when he flickers out, maybe he's still going on and living his life, but you can no longer interact.
Maybe.
哎，这道题如果真的要做，怎么做来呢？直接往下吗？这样。这样就可以了。哦，对哦 ，fuck 老最后一下刚好是，行，我知道了，刚好肌肉性搞反了。那知道了，把底下3个看完了，这段不是很啰嗦。A basic design choice deliberately made, crossing the gap. 哦，就这个。
So will form then
In both, the alternative is
indicating a complex Boolean circuit.
Boolean 没听过，怎么 Boolean？
I think for a lot of people,
there's not really
is a resource that when there's R-dub 2 monsters, other tries, but it's actually not that hard to get right. The execution is not that hard, but then you're so proud of yourself as a player when you pull it off.
这个居然没看过吗？写的 Boolean 没听到过 Boolean， 写的我是看过的。
So let's see. The next one is crossing the gap, and this one has 2 elements.
这肯定看过，这岂不就看过了？
So first there's this cool thing of, well, the cannon doesn't produce a troll unless I bunk that troll, but I want to be up here when the cannon produces a troll. So, okay, I will send my shadow self down there to bunk the troll. No problem. That's kind of fun. A little bit of platform control, but not hard. And then there's this wonderful fact that, since the troll has the purple aura, it can interact with both real things and the shadow things. And then by controlling the timing of the platform and its shadow, because again, everything has a shadow. It's not just that we have a shadow in this world. Then we can actually do this cool 3-way switch and send the troll in several different directions. And, we can briefly create a platform that goes all the way across, which is half real and half shadow, which is pretty nice.
Yeah, for me, that was the neatest part of the level. Hey, can we make the monster walk on nothing for a little bit, right?
Exactly.
Like, isn't that kind of cool?
And we saw a foreshadowing of that earlier, way back in, like, I think the very first world, where we're briefly on nothing because we rewound.
Yeah.
And we're standing on something that
哪
was
来的
there
Boolean？
before.
刚刚看到 Boolean，
And
所以
so
觉得很
now, it's a different version of nothing, and something which is there not before, but in a parallel world, and it's a nice manipulation.
Now, there's an aesthetic game design choice there that can be made one of two ways. So if you have a monster like this that's in both realities, and you want it to be supported, right? Is it that it's supported when it's supported in either reality, or is it supported when it's supported in both realities?
It could be an and or an
这段
or.
好像没听过。
And I chose this version because I wanted to do this, right?
Right.
And it seemed cool. It seemed better to do that because the alternative is, oh, he's kind of falling through stuff. Maybe it would have been good. I don't know. I just never figured it out.
Well, for the sequel, you could have many different colors of sparklies and tiny icons indicating a complex
这里还
Boolean
Boolean
circuit hovering over each troll. Okay, just kidding.
哎，很奇怪，刚刚没有最后一段，然后它不同的地方看同样的对话，它长度还不一样，有这可能？那反正看完了。One of the designer's favorite puzzles, Chris likes it too. This puzzle stands on a shaky foundation. 啊，就这个。
So we notice that the key, like the bunny, has the purple glow. So we know that it's something that both we and our shadow can interact with. And, that gap is wide, but not so wide that I didn't try a couple of times to get the timing just right to jump across it, and it's just a little bit too far. And then, of course, the solution is our own shadow leaps across and hands it to us as we reach out our hand just far enough to catch it, and he dies in the spikes, but he sacrificed himself for us.
There's two things I can say at least about designing this. One of them is the tolerances required to make this work are actually kind of tight again. Anytime you jump, right, you have a choice of how close to the edge of the platform do you jump.
Right.
It has to be completely impossible to jump across the gap from the right, otherwise the puzzle is ruined. At the same time, as we want this gap to be
好像我这个也听过了。
we also need it to be narrow because when you're standing back on the other side, it needs to be plausible that you're grabbing the key. Like, you need to intersect with the key as it arcs over, and that's actually pretty hard.
You know those movies where there's a parallel you in some other universe, and, then there's this awesome scene where finally you and they meet and, reach through, I don't know, a mirror or whatever the thing is that separates us from that parallel universe, and it's poignant and, I don't
poignant,
know, like that to me, this was a really cinematic moment. And I felt for him. I mean, he's dying. He's dying to give us the key.
This is a little bit of a violation of, like, if I were an extreme puzzle purist when I made this game, such as I perhaps am a little bit more today, I would have thought more about whether this is a good idea for a puzzle, because this was one of those top-down puzzle designs where it's like, it would be neat if you had to use one guy to distract a monster, right, and then go sneak in, right? That was the whole idea. And I just thought about how can I make that, and it's difficult to do that because if rabbits are out in the open, you can just kill them by jumping on them, right? Or you could jump over them to get past them. Like, it's actually pretty difficult to come up with a scenario using the base game rules that would enable that puzzle. And so I added a little bit of extra code to this one guy that he just doesn't like to come out of his little cubby hole. So there's no way to jump on him.
Well, rabbits have different personalities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I do
Cubby
think
hole.
there's an extent to which maybe it makes the puzzle a little bit more random, right? Because when you know the complete behavior of something, you have all the information that you need to, like, decide how to deal with it. That said, these rabbits don't show up that often in the game, and when they do, you're sort of panicking anyway, right? But
They are
here
very
it's like,
scary.
if you observe that his behavior is different, right? Like, oh, I expect him to keep chasing me, and then he doesn't quite. Well, how else is the behavior different, right?
I feel bad for him, actually. He looks a little bit sick. he
Yeah,
looks a little
he's-
sad.
Maybe that's why he doesn't want to come out.
Yeah. But it's true. You know you have all this space on the right, and you feel like you ought to be able to lure him out there, and then just bonk him. But
And that just doesn't work. And that's a little weird, but it's not really something that people complain about the game, so maybe it's fine.
all right.
All right，这个肯定是看过的，对，这东西。OK， 这样的话这里就结束了。这个 screen 比较长的，所以这个什么 Word 5，对，这是 Word 4。啊，那我估计应该一共是3个 screen，这是 Word 2嘛，2、3、4了。这个2就非常迅速可以搞定，然后这3，对，这不小，对，不是很多是吧？关键这个 Chris 不算太话痨。对，这个是4，那就这些，清的还挺快的。行，那下一期应该能把这东西搞完，然后而且没准能稍微短一点。我是不喜欢串的，就 design 这期我只搞 design， 也有可能会进到别的部分，但是一定是从 design 进去的，我不会直接从 program 进去。打完 design 来打一期 speed run， 也不准备，也不重新再练了。如果在 design 中间能练的中间能练，不能练就不能练，无所谓。啊，这样了，已经这么多了是吧？那你可不可以假设剩下的已经，如果说按16期算的话，现在已经10多少了？已经11了是吧？这期好像第12期是吧？16期能搞定，这绝对不可能，这点自知之明还是有的。你萨斯冈尼 visuals 跟 sound music 应该不会这么少，再说吧，后面再说。OK， 这一期节奏还可以，关键是看这个，你要10分钟一段，一期我可以搞几段，萨斯冈尼奈的。